Russia responded angrily to a comment by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Kazakhstan might have a hard time getting rid of Russian troops, saying he should reflect instead on U.S. military meddling around the world. As a response, Russia's foreign ministry called Blinken's remark typically offensive and accused him of joking about tragic events in Kazakhstan. Blinken challenged Russia's justification for sending forces into Kazakhstan after days of violent unrest in the Central Asian country. He said, "One lesson of recent history is that once Russians are in your house, it's sometimes very difficult to get them to leave." Russia's foreign ministry called Blinken's remark typically offensive and accused him of joking about tragic events in Kazakhstan. It said Washington should analyze its own track record of interventions in countries such as Vietnam and Iraq. The ministry said, "If Antony Blinken is so into history lessons, here's one that comes to mind: when Americans are in your house, it can be difficult to stay alive, not being robbed or raped." Mr. Blinken's jab turned into actually a self-inflicted one, as the entire 300 years of American statehood teaches us the above-mentioned lesson. Indians of North America, Koreans, Vietnamese, Iraqis, Panamanians, Yugoslavs, Libyans, Syrians and many other unfortunate peoples who had the bad luck to see these uninvited guests at their doorstep have a lot to add. The Russian ministry said the deployment in Kazakhstan was a legitimate response to Kazakhstan's request for support from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, an alliance of ex-Soviet states that includes Russia. The Kazakh intervention comes at a time of high tension in Moscow's relations with Washington as the two countries prepare for talks on the Ukraine crisis. Moscow has deployed large numbers of troops near its border with Ukraine but denies Western suggestions it plans to invade. Russia's decision to send paratroopers into Kazakhstan, where a crackdown on violent anti-government protests has left dozens dead, injects additional uncertainty into upcoming talks over a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine. The question is whether the unrest in Kazakhstan has changed the calculations of Russian President Vladimir Putin as he weighs his options in Ukraine. Some say Putin may not want to engage in two conflicts at the same time, while others say Russia has the military capacity to do both and he will decide separately on whether to attack Ukraine. The instability in Kazakhstan may even add new urgency to Putin's desire to shore up Russia's power in the region. Both Kazakhstan and Ukraine are former Soviet republics that Putin has sought to keep under Moscow's influence, but so far with vastly different results. Ukraine, an aspiring democracy that has turned decisively toward the West, has been locked in deadly conflict with Russia since Putin seized Crimea in 2014 and backed an insurgency in the eastern Donbass region. Kazakhstan, meanwhile, has been ruled in the 3 decades since the Soviet collapse by autocrats who have maintained close security and political ties with Russia. Russian troops entered Kazakhstan after Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev invoked the help of a Russia-led military alliance. The following day, with Russian troops helping to restore control over the airport and guarding government buildings, he ordered his forces to shoot to kill any protesters who don't surrender. That led to Washington and Moscow exchanging new barbs on the eve of a week of meetings over Ukraine that begins with talks between senior US and Russian officials in Geneva. Pro-Western analysts argue that Kazakhstan is on the list of former Soviet republics whose independence is now being threatened by Russia. According to them, Putin is using a similar playbook in Kazakhstan to one that he has used over almost a decade to threaten the sovereignty of Ukraine. They claim that Russia's involvement in Kazakhstan looks very familiar to the Ukrainian crisis. They say it's similar to what happened in Ukraine beginning in 2014 when peaceful protesters were met with violence by the government and a protest grew into a revolution that ultimately overthrew the Russian-backed leadership of the country. Seizing on that moment of domestic unrest in 2014, Putin gave direct orders to annex Crimea, a Ukrainian territory home to a key Russian naval base. Shortly afterward, he supported a war mounted by so-called Russian-speaking separatists in Ukraine's eastern regions. For more than 8 years now, the Russian Federation has continued to support the conflict in Ukraine and has recently threatened Ukraine with a full invasion. This most recent version of Putin's aggression toward Ukraine came in November 2021, when he staged 175,000 troops along the Ukraine border. His goal, to use a potential invasion as leverage to stop Ukraine from joining the alliance of Western countries known as NATO. In Kazakhstan, as in Ukraine in 2014, the Russian government explains its military presence as appropriate and requested by a legitimate government. As in Ukraine, the Russian government emphasizes that external forces are responsible for unrest in the former Soviet Republic. The Russian Federation has pointed out the need to protect a Russian-speaking population. These tendencies of the Russian government to assert dominion over former territories that it lost during the breakup of the Soviet Empire demonstrate that Russia is willing to act quickly and do anything to keep control of its neighborhood. This is an important message about what the Western leaders can expect from a meeting with Russian officials in Geneva on January 10 to discuss the conflict building again along Ukraine's border and Russia's demands that NATO not expand to Ukraine. Russia has long seen Kazakhstan as within its sphere of influence. In a press conference in 2021, Putin called Kazakhstan a Russian-speaking country in every sense of the word.
Я очень благодарен руководству Казахстана за внимательное отношение к поддержанию развития русского языка. Но вы же сами знаете, как в Казахстане, сколько людей изучают русский язык. Это русскоговорящая страна в полном смысле этого слова. Развивается количество, увеличивается количество и школ с изучением русского языка, и филиалов высших учебных заведений.
Earlier, Putin also claimed that before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhs never had a state of their own. In December 2020, two members of Russia's parliament claimed that territories of northern Kazakhstan were a big gift from Russia to Kazakhstan. Such claims are reminiscent of the language that Putin has applied to Ukraine. He has often claimed that Ukraine was not a real country, including in an article published by the Kremlin in July 2021, in which he claimed that modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. Putin's references to a Russian-speaking population in Kazakhstan are reminiscent of the experience of Ukraine's Crimea region. In April 2014, Russian soldiers appeared on the streets of Crimea, forced Ukrainian soldiers to leave their posts, and oversaw a so-called referendum that allowed for Crimea to be integrated into the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation said then and continues to claim that its interest in Ukraine is a continued concern for the welfare of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, which in Russia's view is being oppressed. On the other side, Vladislav Inozemtsev defines the current process as Russia's third Cold War and warns the Russian authorities to be careful. He says, "We shouldn't forget that each time, Russia or the Soviet Union lacked the economic and technological might that would have given it the upper hand in the ensuing confrontation. Although Moscow has had the capability to wipe its enemy off the face of the earth ever since it developed nuclear weapons in the mid-20th century, it would have also been blown to smithereens in the process, with the result that it was unable to win any of these Cold Wars, and each of its defeats ended in a serious crisis of the entire social model of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union."